Mrs. Parker. Today we are going to analyze Gift of the Magi using races. So this lesson was inspired by Guidebook Lesson 32 from the 7th grade unit Christmas Carol. Today we will learn the 5 steps for a constructed response, which is the R.A.C.E.S strategy. We will read the short story The Gift of the Magi by O.Henry. We will practice using R.A.C.E.S, and then it'll lead us to our task, which is where you will analyze the author's use of description and setting and its impact on characterization using R.A.C.E.S to respond to a constructed response question. So here's our objective. I'm going to show it to you now, and then I'll show you again at the end of the lesson. And it's in the form of a question because I want you to ask yourself, can you cite relevant textual evidence to support an analysis of what the text says, as well as inferences drawn from the text? Here are the materials you'll need. You need The Gift of the Magi by O.Henry and the split page notes handout. I will be completing my split page notes handout in Google Docs, but do it whichever way works best for you. If you prefer to print it out and write it out, you can definitely do that as well. So I want to quickly, and I'm going to emphasize quickly because I'm not going to take too much time on this, but I want to go over the R.A.C.E.S strategy. You may have heard of it before, but this is a writing strategy that helps keep your writing focused and organized when responding to a constructed response question. I'm going to go into a little more detail for each letter of the strategy. So we have R, and in R, you're going to restate the question. You're turning the question into a statement. So for example, if the question is, what is the theme of the passage? Well, you're just going to take away what and take is and move it to the end, and we're just restating. The theme of the passage is. There's our restate. Now our restate will go along with our answer. So your A is your answer to the question. This is your claim. And be sure you're answering all parts because there are times where a prompt may have 2 questions or more built in. So be sure you're answering all parts. So let's go back to our previous example of what is the theme of the passage. So remember I restated the theme of the passage is, and your answer is just what comes right after. So maybe for this one, it would be the theme of the passage is that one should not give up and try until they succeed. That would take care of my R and my A. So now we move on to C. Well, here you're going to cite some text evidence. And you need to be sure that you're choosing evidence that supports your answer. And you could use a direct quote or a paraphrase. And I want you to use evidence-based terms to include your evidence. So you'd have your RA, and then maybe you're going to say, according to the passage, open quotes, and give me your evidence there. And if you're giving evidence, then you need to be sure that you're explaining it, which leads us to our E. You need to explain how and why your evidence supports your answer. This isn't a summary of your evidence, but it's more of an explanation of the connection between your answer and your evidence. Why did you choose that evidence? Tell me here. You chose it for a reason, and it should be because it supports your answer. Well, explain to me how it supports your answer. And you can use sentence starters such as this shows, but a sentence starter is not always necessary. And then finally, we get to our S, where all you're doing right here is summarizing the claim. You're restating the question as a conclusion. So now that we went very quickly over R.A.C.E.S, I want us to go ahead and try to use it in a lesson. So in this mini lesson, we will read The Gift of the Magi, and then we will answer some questions using this R.A.C.E.S strategy. So what I want you to do is open up to your copy of The Gift of the Magi by O.Henry. And I want you to follow along. I'm going to play an audio recording. And I want you to follow along to that audio recording as it goes.
The Gift of the Magi by O.Henry. $1.87. That was all. And 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it, $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl, so Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the house is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home, a furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim, and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now, there were 2 possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window some day to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a moment and stood still while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sofronie, hair goods of all kinds. 1 flight up, Della ran and collected herself panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sofronie. Will you buy my hair? Asked Della. I buy hair, said Madame. Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it. Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practiced hand. Give it to me quick, said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas, and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes, her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, long, carefully, and critically. "If Jim doesn't kill me," she said to herself, "before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? Oh, what could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock, the coffee was made and the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair, away down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying a little silent prayer about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I am still pretty." The door opened, and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat, and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you." "You cut off your hair?" asked Jim, laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet even after the hardest mental labor. "Cut it off and sold it," said Della. "Don't you like me just as well anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I?" Jim looked about the room curiously. "You say your hair is gone?" he said, with an air almost of idiocy. "You needn't look for it," said Della. "It's sold, I tell you, sold and gone too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered," she went on with sudden serious sweetness, "but nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim?" Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He enfolded his Della. For 10 seconds, let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week, or $1,000,000 a year, what is the difference? A mathematician or a wit would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it upon the table. "Don't make any mistake, Dell," he said, "about me. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first." White fingers and nimble, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs, the set of combs side and back that Della had worshipped long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoise shell with jeweled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers. But the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and a smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leaped up like a little singed cat and cried, "Oh, oh!" Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with the reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it a dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," he said, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. And now suppose you put the chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of two foolish children in a flat, who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these two were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi. N.
I hope you enjoyed that story. We are going to go ahead and move on to our split page notes now. So we are going to be practicing one together, and then I'm going to have you do 2 and 3 on your own until we ultimately lead to our express or understanding task. So I want to focus on paragraphs 1 through 5. And we are going to focus on just those 5 paragraphs to answer questions 1, 2, and 3 using R.A.C.E.S. Let's do one together. So I'm going to go to my split page notes here. Okay, so our question is, consider the number of references to money in the opening paragraphs of the story. To what is the author trying to draw attention? So the first thing I need to do is restate, right? Because that's the first part of R.A.C.E.S. So to restate, here's my question here. I'm going to take that and restate it. So the author is trying to draw attention to, so there's my restate. Now I have to think of my answer. Well, if I go back to paragraphs 1 through 5, all these references to money, it's clear that he's trying to draw attention to the fact that they're fairly poor and they don't have many financial resources, right? So I'm going to go and use that as my claim. I'm going to add that to my restate. So there's my restate. Now let me add my answer. So the author is trying to draw attention to the fact that Jim and Della are poor with very few financial resources. So there I've taken care of my R and A. So next is C. I need to cite evidence. So I need to think of an evidence-based term. And I want to say the text states. That's my evidence-based term I'm going to use. And then I'm going to open up my quotation marks so that way I can add a quote from the text. If I go back into the text, remember I'm only focusing on paragraphs 1 through 5. But there are plenty of things that the author states that would prove that they are poor. I mean, right here where it's talking about their apartment, or even here where it is talking about how she had to save the pennies, one and two at a time. I'm actually going to use this one here. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to use that as my evidence. Formatting's a little off, but that's okay. Let's see. Okay, so I have this as my evidence here. And what I'm going to do now is put my end quotation marks, and then I need to explain it, right? So I'm not just summarizing this, but I want to make a connection between this and this, my C and my A. So how does this show that they are poor? Well, I would say that Della having to count pennies and then only being able to save up $1.87 shows the lack of finances that this family has, right? So I'm going to say that here. So Della having to count pennies to only save up $1.87 shows the lack of financial resources that this family has. Okay, so I've restated, I've answered, I've cited evidence, and now I've also explained my evidence. Sometimes you'll want to explain in a couple sentences, so I'm going to go into a little more detail with my explanation because remember, I'm trying to answer why is this author trying to draw attention to the money? Well, he mentions how she only saved up $1.87, and it's important for the reader to understand that, right? So I'm going to say it is important for the reader to understand the financial situation that the family is in. Because that's what that's doing there, right? That's explaining the financial situation. So now that's taking care of my E. I just wanted to add a little more. And then now I'm going to summarize. So remember, I'm restating the question as a conclusion, which is to what is the author trying to draw attention to? And we know he's trying to draw attention to the lack of financial resources because it really explains their motivation and sacrifices later in the story, right? And a lot of that has to do with it being Christmas time. So I'm going to go in and just summarize. So because it is Christmas time, and because they lack financial resources, it is significant to know their situation because it explains their motivation and sacrifices later in the story. Okay, so here's our answer. We've restated and answered there. We've cited evidence there, explained it here, and then I summarized here. So what I want you to do now is I want you to pause the video and I want you to do an individual practice, which is answering questions 2 and 3. There is an additional question, but I only want you to focus on questions 2 and 3. Respond using R.A.C.E.S and be sure you are citing evidence that supports your answer. Pause the video and come back when you're ready to continue. So I want to go ahead and quickly review questions 2 and 3. I have my copy here that I've worked on. So this one, it was asking what adjective is repeated 3 times. You should have pointed out that gray is repeated 3 times. You may have cited where it's that said the gray cat walking the gray fence in the gray backyard. And then remember I said I want you to make sure you answer all parts. Well, this is 2 questions. What is the effect of this on the narrative? Well, think about the repetition of that color gray, right? So that really shows Della's mood and situation. We know she's sad. So let's go into this 3rd question. 2 was fairly easy. Let's go into number 3. So, how does the drabness of this domestic scene contrast with the stated time of year? Once again, here's an example of using races. We know that the stated time of year is Christmas, right? But whenever they're describing their apartment, it's talking about the shabby little couch and, how it's run down and it's poorly furnished is really how the author describes it. And he uses that word gray. So it kind of creates a mood of gloom and hopelessness. But if we think of Christmas time isn't usually filled with gloom and hopelessness. Christmas usually evokes feelings of joy and hope, right? So the description of the apartment, which is gloomy and hopeless, really goes against the feeling that Christmas usually evokes, which is joyful and happiness, right? Okay, so I want to take a look at 2 questions before we move on to your LEU, which is your Let's Express Understanding. And I want you to think about this. So think about, why might O.Henry have chosen Christmas for the setting of the story? And how does this setting impact the characters and meaning of the text? I want you to take a little bit of think time right now before I come back and we're going to discuss these 2. So if we think about Christmas, that's a holiday that's typically associated with sharing gifts, right? And celebrating those that we love. So it's clear that Jim and Della love each other, but it's also clear that they don't have a lot of money. So they're unable to buy each other gifts during this time where that's typically what people do. So this setting of Christmas time, it really helps advance the plot. It creates and supports this conflict that these characters are facing. So this holiday, it really allows the reader to understand the motivations and the sacrifices that these characters make for each other, all because they love each other. So now we're going to go on to our LEU. You are going to express your understanding by answering that last question on your split page notes handout. So using races, I want you to write a response to the last question. Be sure you are citing relevant textual evidence that supports your answer. Be sure that you can make that connection between your answer and your evidence. You'll be able to explain why you chose it. So let's quickly review races. R, you're restating the question. A, answer the question. C, cite evidence to support your answer. E, explain your evidence. And S, summarize your claim. So I want you to go into your split page notes and I want you to answer this question here at the very bottom using races. How does O.Henry's use of description and setting impact our understanding of Jim and Della? Pause the video and come back when you are ready to continue. Alrighty, so let's revisit that objective. Can you cite relevant textual evidence to support an analysis of what the text says, as well as inferences drawn from the text? If you are able to accurately cite evidence and explain it to support your answer of that last question, then chances are you can answer yes to this objective. So in this lesson, you practice using the R.A.C.E.S strategy. You also read the short story, The Gift of the Magi by O.Henry, and you analyze the impact of description and setting on characterization using the R.A.C.E.S writing strategy. Once again, this lesson is inspired by Lesson 32 of the Christmas Carol unit from Guidebook.